Okay, good morning. So this is the first little video in our next unit about genes and heredity. On the screen here you can see a variety of interesting little traits. It should be a quick trip to the mirror for you to take a look and see which of these traits that you can do. So take a look at your ears. Do they have attached earlobes or unattached? Mine are unattached. Do you have 5 or 6 fingers on your hands? This gentleman here in the middle has, unfortunately, 2 thumbs. Can you roll your tongue? Or not, some of you can't. What color is your hair or your eyes? And I've got my funky kind of red hair. It's not as red as it used to be, but it was this color. Are your eyes blue? Are they green? Are they brown? How about the color of your skin? Whole different colors or ranges. Is your skin smooth, one color, or is it freckly like mine? All of these are examples of human traits that are controlled by heredity. So this whole unit here is about how do traits get passed on, what kinds of traits do we have, and what kinds of things influence how those traits get expressed. So what is a trait? Trait has a very simple definition. A trait is any identifiable characteristic of an organism. So again, it can be your hair color, your eye color. It can be really obvious outside things, and that's usually what we tend to talk about. But keep in mind that traits can be internal things as well. So your blood type, whether you're type A positive or O negative or something in between, or even your ability to be resistant to certain types of disease, whether or not you had chickenpox as a kid or a vaccination for it and can no longer get that disorder. Those are traits as well. You just can't see them on the outside. Some of our traits are heritable. Heritable means you get them from your parents. Some traits are acquired. That would be the opposite. The ones that we get from your parents, some of them obey really simple rules. Some of them are much more complex. So you can see over here, there's a couple ones. We'll look at this again later. A couple really easy heritable traits. Do you have a widow's peak? This gentleman on the left here has that little point of hair right on his forehead, whereas the guy over here on the right does not have a widow's peak. He's a straight. Mine's pretty smooth. I don't have a widow's peak. And what's your thumb style like? That's another simple trait. You have hitchhiker's thumb. I do not. Some of you, when you make that thumbs up, your thumb just tips way over, but just a funky little trait that some of you have. So genetics is the science of studying those traits. Are traits heritable through simple rules, or are they heritable through more complex rules? So that's what genetics studies. On the next slide here, you'll see there's a whole bunch of different ranges of heredity. The ones we're going to study mostly center on the genetic traits, but there's lots of different things. For example, we can talk about acquired traits. I know it seems obvious to us now, but traits that you acquire during your life, you cannot pass on to your children. Arnold Schwarzenegger does not have giant bodybuilding children. People that are amputees, lost a leg in war, do not have children that don't have a leg when they're born. Dogs that have docked tails. If you have a little nubby tail that's really short, that's something that we do to them. Their puppies have full-length tails. Those are acquired traits. Those don't get passed along. But less obvious ones like your hairstyle or even immunity, like if you get a vaccine. That's why everybody has to go through that. Some traits are simple heritable traits, simple heredity. And these are the ones that are the really easy ones for us to study in terms of genetics. Things like eye color, hair color, your blood type, number of fingers, those ones I had on that first sheet, your skin color, things like that. Those are genetic traits. And some of them are only controlled by one gene. They're simple for us to study. Some of them are a little bit more complex. This is a strong heredity here with genetics and environment. So things like your skin color, yeah, there's a genetic trait that determines what color skin you have. If you have dark-colored parents, you'll probably have dark-colored skin, light-colored parents, light-colored skin, or one of each, you're going to have probably medium kind of skin. But even so, during your life, the environment that you're in is going to control how deeply that trait gets developed. So in the summertime, I'm a little bit darker, not much, than I am right now, but in the wintertime, I'm quite a bit lighter. So even during my life, my skin color changes. Same thing with hair color. Your hair color oftentimes will change. Some kids are born with very, very light hair, and it gets darker as they get older. That's a combination of genetic as well as environment, developmental environment. Furthermore, we can get even a little bit more complex. Things that have major environmental influences. We're starting to realize now that certain complex traits like your personality, your IQ, which is still kind of controversial, even your idea about how likely you are to get certain kinds of cancer or develop alcoholism, that there's a genetic component to this. We know they run in families, that if your parents were alcoholics, if your parents were addicted to or are addicted to nicotine, then there's a much higher likelihood that you could have those same kinds of addictions or issues. Same thing, your personality traits. Some of those are born in you. Some people are naturally outgoing or naturally shy and reserved, naturally easygoing or upset easily. These kinds of things are somewhat born in you, but then your experiences really play a huge role in how they develop. And then last but not least, this last thing, cultural heredity. This is not really genetic heredity at all. Not really. It isn't any kind of genetic heredity. This is simply that idea that we can pass traits, language, culture, religion, habits, diet, all kinds of things. These are things you get from your families, get from your culture, from where you live. Certainly not genetic. These are learned behaviors. And learned behaviors, while they do sort of inherit from one generation to the next, you can unlearn and relearn them. They're not strictly controlled by any sort of rule on the inside, thank goodness, right? How do we know if traits are genetic or not? Some traits it's hard to tell, but we have a variety of different tools that we can use. For example, this top one, selective breeding. It's pretty easy. It's what we do, say, with dogs and cats. It's what we can do out in our garden. We can take two different colors of dogs, for example, breed them together and see what kind of happens. This is how we got things like black labs, where we look for particular kinds of characteristics, repeatedly breed those guys together until that trait becomes pure breeding. And if we know that a trait does become consistent like that, it's got to be genetic. It's not a learned behavior. We can do things in humans, identical twin studies, maybe a little bit more ethical maybe with humans, right? We can't just selectively breed humans together to see if skin color is genetic. You have to take a look at people that, I should say, natural offspring of relationships and see what their outcome is. It's just naughty, and see what kinds of traits get passed on. So we can take a look at two identical twins raised apart. Do they both have an identical opportunity of developing alcoholism, or do they both have the same skin color or hair color? We can also look at these things called pedigrees. Pedigrees is this big monstrous thing that you've got down at the bottom down here. A pedigree is just a family tree, circles and squares and lines and things like that. Circle indicates that you're a female, square is a male. A line like this, horizontal, like that one, means that you're married to one another, mating with one another. A line like this would indicate all of their children. You can see Queen Victoria and Albert were quite busy, but they had a whole bunch of kids down here. And the color coding then indicates whether or not they had a particular disease. In this case, it's a disease called hemophilia. Hemophilia is a disease where your blood doesn't clot normally. And we found out, or they found out, I should say, sort of unfortunately, that this is a genetic trait in this particular family. And a lot of the men, all these purple squares in here, ended up with issues. Oh, no, sorry, the orange squares in here. Here they are, ended up with issues, this hemophilia disorder, and a lot of them died very young as a result of that. These last ones up here, statistical analysis, medical records, birth, death records, we can look at long-term studies over time and look for certain statistical trends that, this particular gene was passed on 75% of the time, or 50% of the time, or 0% of the time, and we can kind of get some more information about genetic patterns. This guy right here, Gregor Mendel, he's the dude. Look at that man, sexy. He is the father of modern genetics. He was a monk, grew up in the 1800s, lived in Austria of all places, so he probably talked like Arnold Schwarzenegger. Yeah. He was actually fascinated by mathematics. He looked at statistics a lot, statistic patterns, and he worked in the garden of all the crazy jobs that he had. That's what he did. He was studying these dumb peas, and you can see this big picture that I've got on here. He studied these garden peas that he grew and started to recognize some patterns. He started to try to do basically selective breeding with them and go, why do some of these peas have purple flowers and some of them are white flowers and some are yellow and some are green, some are tall and some are short? And so he started really trying to kind of investigate what that was. And in his day, you need to write this one down, his day, people thought that blending inheritance was the rule. And this kind of makes sense. You take a tall plant and you breed it with a short plant, you probably should get medium-sized plants. Makes sense. If you take a red flower and a white flower plant and breed them together, you might get pink flowers, just like you do with paint, red paint, white paint. And so this is kind of what he was expecting. This is not really what he saw, and it was very confusing for him. As he was doing the selective breeding, he found that there were 7 different traits that he could make breed pure. So he could breed plants that had yellow peas. How strange is that, right? Versus green peas. And he could make that trait consistent. Same thing, flowers. He could breed plants that had white flowers all the time and plants that had purple flowers all the time, generation to generation. And all these different kind of traits that are in here. Can you imagine a wrinkly yellow plant? Kind of weird looking. But he figured out ways to do this. And as he thought about the statistics of this, he realized that blending, number one, couldn't be the rule. That something else had to be going on. And he called this thing going on factors. Some sort of factor had to have been passed on from parent to offspring that was causing this trait to appear. And not only was it one factor, it must have been 2. Because if it was just one, then the offspring would look like one or the other parent, but the other trait would never come back. It's kind of complex, but he realized that there had to be two different factors passing on, and we know these today as being genes. So as he was doing his experiments, for example, I've got one on here. He had green pods and yellow pods. This is the outside, not the peas. When he bred those two plants together, a green plant and a yellow plant, he realized that every single one of that offspring, every time he did it, was green. None of the yellow ever showed up. And it wasn't in between, so definitely was not blending. We didn't get a yellowish green. Something about these factors, that some of that green factor was getting passed on. So he had to come up with a new language to talk about this. Furthermore, and this is what I have written down in the green here, kind of the most confusing thing for him is if you take these same green ones, these F1 all green plants, and you breed them back together, you get yellow plants back about 25% of the time. 75% of the offspring are green, but 25% of them are yellow. That doesn't make any sense at all. It's like saying I take green paint and mix it with green paint, and some of the time I get yellow paint. Doesn't make any sense. So it had to do with his factors. So he came up with language to deal with this language we still use today. He did not know the word genes, so that's a new one. But we now know that his factors are what we would call genes. He did come up with this word, and this is a critical word for you to know. These different ideas, these different colors maybe, are called alleles. You need to write that one down. Allele. It's a weird looking word. Allele? No, allele. An allele is a different characteristic. So there's a green allele and a yellow allele. If we look back at that previous one, take a look at the flowers. There's a white allele and a purple allele. There's a yellow pea allele and a green pea allele. Those are the different varieties that we're talking about. Which one showed up? It's called dominant. So in this experiment at the top, when we had green crossed with yellow and all the ones were green, he called that the dominant trait. Green must be dominant because it was showing up, and recessive is the yellow trait because it was hiding in that second generation. So he didn't know these off the top. He had to breed them together and find it out. Furthermore, as he was doing generation and generation and different traits and looking what happened, he came up with two rules. These are Mendel's laws of genetics, and you need to know what these are. So the first rule is called segregation. Segregation states that only one factor is passed on from generation to generation. These F1Ps have two factors. They got a green factor from this parent and a yellow factor from this parent. And they've got two, a yellow one and a green one. Why are they green? Because the green one's dominant and it shows. But when these F1s breed, only one of those two will get passed on. Some of the times the green one will pass on, sometimes the yellow one will pass on. That's his rule called segregation. You only pass on one of your two chromosomes. Furthermore, his second rule was that the way that one gene gets passed on has nothing to do with how another gene gets passed on. It's called independent assortment. So whether or not you have green pods or yellow pods has nothing to do with whether or not you have white flowers or purple flowers or whether you're a tall plant or a short plant. They're independent of one another. So those are his two major rules: segregation, independent assortment. Today we know that genetics, the factors of Mendel, are actually related to DNA, and it's pretty obvious to this point. You've been taught this since you were young. But it took almost 100 years. People, they almost laughed him out of the monastery when he came up with this idea. But it took a long time for scientists to realize that DNA was the stuff that was causing these particular factors. And we now know that DNA, this particular chemical, is located in our chromosomes. You guys remember this funky X shape that's right here? And that in each one of these little sections here, there can be genes. A gene is simply a section of DNA, and DNA is what's in a chromosome. So it's just a little part of it. This picture down here at the bottom, here you've got a chromosome, right? A single chromatid. Here's our chromosome right here with our sister chromatids where it's duplicated, and each one of these little different colored bands here sort of represents the possible different gene that's on that chromosome. We now know that there's lots of chromosomes on lots of genes on a different chromosome, but that's a modern kind of discovery. Furthermore, we know that a trait, this one right here, a trait, the way that you look, act, whatever you express as characteristic, is always the result of two different genes working together. You're either going to show the dominant one or the recessive one, but it's always at least two. That's working together, one on each chromosome, one from mom, one from dad. Last but not least, what's the role now? We've kind of gone through this idea of traits. So what really is the role of genetics? Here's our friends with their funky hair and thumbs again. Is everything genetic? Is everything as simple as this? Well, yeah. Well, no. Well, kind of. Well, not really. Well, maybe. You know what I'm saying? Yes, there's mostly genetics, not all of it, not that cultural stuff. But we now know some simple rules, that we've got a lot of different characteristics. Some of them are Mendelian characteristics. In other words, they're simple, dominant, and recessive. If you have the gene, you show one trait. If you don't have the gene, you don't. For example, in these guys, hitchhiker's thumb is dominant. No hitchhiker's thumb is recessive. I believe widow's peak is dominant. No widow's peak is recessive. It's just a particular characteristic. Same thing, eye color. There is a single gene that determines whether or not you have this brown pigment. It's dominant to have brown pigment in your eyes. It's recessive to have blue pigment in your eyes, or no pigment, I should say, in your eyes. But we now know there's a lot more variations to it. For example, there's all these other kind of craziness on here. We'll get to this in the next part of the unit. But there's some other rules, not just simple dominance. We call them incomplete dominance, polygenics, where there's lots of genes involved, gene interactions, where one gene turns on another gene or turns off another gene, all kinds of stuff that makes it much more complex. Furthermore, we know that chromosomes themselves play a role. You guys know about the X and the Y chromosome. That's a particular whole package of DNA that determines whether or not you're a boy or a girl, or the pair of them determine whether you're a boy or a girl. And there's genes that are associated with those as well. We could talk about chromosomal things where you have an extra chromosome, like Down syndrome. We can even talk about particular traits like color blindness. I know there's a couple of you out there. And this is a particular gene that's associated with the X chromosome, and that's why you got it. You got that trait, and maybe other people don't. And then last but not least, and this is kind of the big one, there's a lot of interactions. Your genes don't act alone. Some of them do, like whether or not you make brown in your eyes or brown in your skin. That's a pretty simple trait. But that interaction with the environment, not only your external environment like temperature, things like that, but your internal chemical environment development also makes a big deal in terms of how you express certain genes, not to mention your experiences and how you've acquired other sorts of traits. So there you got it. That's the whole kind of picture of kind of what traits are, what heredity is, an introduction to Mendel and his ideas of independent assortment and segregation. Those are big takeaways from this, and that idea of that interplay between genetics and environment. So go look in the mirror, see how weird you are. That's genetics right there. Blame your parents. Bye. See you in class.